Each week on the Viewpoints Radio podcast, you'll hear from our leading experts on an important topic within education, history, society, psychology, and more.
When you have lawmakers that create systematic policies that are really only set up to favor people with deep pockets, then you have the rise of corporate industry taking over.
Viewpoints Radio podcast is produced by our team of award-winning journalists. Subscribe today by searching Viewpoints Radio wherever you listen to podcasts.
In 2021, 15-year-old Ethan Crumbley took a gun out of his backpack and opened fire at his Michigan high school. He murdered 4 students and injured 7 others. Ethan was sentenced to life imprisonment plus an additional 24 years, but to the shock of many around the country, the charges didn't stop there. In 2022, we reported that his parents, James and Jennifer Crumbley, were each charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. Earlier this year, both parents were found guilty of all charges. This is the first time that parents of a mass shooter have been held accountable for the actions of their child. It's left many people wondering what kind of precedent this will set and where the line is drawn for parental accountability in the eyes of the law. Dr. Carol Lieberman, a forensic psychiatrist and trial expert witness, says that to understand the Crumbley's convictions, we need to take a look at the family dynamic over the years.
The parents have been neglectful of him and abused by neglect for a very long time, since he was a very little young boy. The parents would leave him in the house alone and go off drinking or go off somewhere and not leave him with a telephone, and for hours and hours. And he would have to, when he wanted to try to get them to come home or he needed something, he would have to go to a neighbor and ask a neighbor to call them.
And while Lieberman says there was a history of neglect that was painted throughout the trials, the events that took place right before the shooting seem to be the final pieces of evidence against the Crumbleys. In a text Ethan sent to a friend before the school shooting, he wrote that he asked his father to take him to a doctor for help. James Crumbley refused, opting instead to give him pills and the advice to, quote, suck it up.
He did say, I need to be taken to a doctor. And instead they bought him a gun. It's not brain surgery to know that if your son is having psychological problems, and he talked about hearing voices, he talked about thinking there were demons in the house, hearing all these things, and this was going on for a while. And they should have realized, I think, he said his father told him to suck it up, and his mother, didn't act on it either. And so eventually, as he wrote, his diaries traced the trajectory from when he was first telling them about his, or even thinking himself about his mental problems and thinking, if this doesn't get fixed, if they don't take me to a doctor, I'm going to shoot up the school. What more do you have to have as proof?
The Crumbleys failed to act even when contacted by Ethan's school. The morning of the shooting, they were called into the high school, shown disturbing artwork their son had drawn, and were advised to take him to a hospital. Instead of acting on the recommendation, the Crumbleys told the administration that they didn't have the time. After the Crumbleys' convictions, many have questioned where the line of accountability is. However, John Donahue, professor of law at Stanford University, says it wasn't simply willful ignorance that led to the guilty verdicts. In fact, after sentencing both parents, the judge noted that this wasn't a case of bad parenting, but repeated action and inaction that laid the groundwork for their son to murder 4 children.
I do think another factor in this case that made the prosecutors inclined to seek a prison sentence was that the mother had texted to the son, I'm not mad at you, just don't get caught in the future. So it sort of signaled this almost conspiratorial anti-law attitude.
Donahue says these convictions set a precedent for future trials holding responsible parties accountable, regardless of who pulled the trigger. However, he says that it will be a tough line for future courts and prosecutors to connect.
If I see my child is severely drunk and I say, here, why don't you run out to the store and get me more liquor or something like that, and the child kills someone, the prosecutors would not have a hard time in saying that I should be culpable for manslaughter in a circumstance like that, or negligent homicide. But in the gun area, it's often at least one step removed because the parents have just allowed the child access to the gun rather than directly handed it to them on their way to commit a crime.
Regardless of how future cases play out, Donahue hopes these convictions kick other parents into gear to pay attention to the mental health of their children. Lieberman also notes that other potential trials will have different levels of accountability depending on which state they're in.
Not all would be able to charge them with involuntary manslaughter, but it is a gray area as to what the point is, it really is in the mind of the jury, there are jury instructions, but I think in this case, in the Crumbley case, they were poster parents for parents who deserve to get a verdict of involuntary manslaughter. The father bought him the gun. The mother took him to the gun range and she ignored all his texts. The father told him to suck it up, not to go to a psychiatrist.
But while Donahue thinks these convictions set the groundwork for more parents being held accountable for their role in mass shootings, he doesn't believe it will greatly impact how some Americans recklessly store their guns.
How much this is going to change the behavior of so many of the parents who are so oblivious. Just a few years ago in the Highland Park parade shooting in Illinois, it turned out that the father of the Highland Park shooter had sponsored his son's application for a gun permit, which he otherwise could not have gotten, even though the son had threatened to, quote, kill everyone. It's sort of an everyday event that parents in America are exposing not only themselves, but their children and others at risk by making their guns available to their troubled children. And we see this over and over again. The classic example is what I call the Nancy Lanza problem.
Nancy Lanza was one of 27 people her son murdered in 2012 during what's known as the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. Nancy was described as a gun enthusiast and often took her sons to shooting ranges in the New York City suburbs.
And knowing that her son was so deeply troubled, she made those weapons available to him. In fact, had planned on buying him another gun for Christmas. So this is madness at a deep level, but, relatively common in the United States, where many parents are very obsessed with securing weapons and making them available to their troubled children.
A 2023 study in JAMA Pediatrics reveals that the firearms used in school shootings over the last 26 years were most frequently stolen from the shooter's family member or relative. Secure storage laws vary state to state. Some require the weapons to be properly locked up, with consequences for failing to secure a gun. Other states have child access prevention laws that only penalize gun owners if a child gets a hold of the firearm. However, only 27 states and Washington, D.C. have safe storage policies. And even if they were expanded to every state in America, we're often only made aware of a dangerous situation after a gun has been taken. Donahue says other countries implement routine spot checks to make sure gun owners are properly securing their weapons, but recognizes that it may be a tough policy to implement in America. Which is why, in light of the Crumbley's recent convictions, he hopes more people are motivated to take matters into their own hands and secure their weapons so only the owners have access to them. You can find more information about Dr. Carol Lieberman, John Donahue, and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. For more behind the scenes, follow Radio Health Journal on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our production manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Greg Johnson.
Each week on the Viewpoints Radio podcast, you'll hear from our leading experts on an important topic within education, history, society, psychology, and more.
Building AI systems is like having kids. You want your kids to be smarter than you are. You want your kids to be more successful than you are. And at the end of the day, you want your kids not to kill you.
Viewpoints Radio podcast is produced by our team of award-winning journalists. Subscribe today by searching Viewpoints Radio wherever you listen to podcasts.